The debate didn't end that night. When Kennedy's team made these commercials from debate footage, the Republicans accused them of purposely selecting bad takes of Nixon. The Democrats' defense? There were no good takes of Nixon.
You could be the most brilliant candidate in the world, but if you don't have that charisma, that ability to communicate and cut across through that 21 inches of television, you can't win. You got to have that personality, that television persona that very few candidates really have.
In 40 years of TV, candidates have tried tactics of every nature to enhance their image. In 1956, Adlai Stevenson tried to present himself as a regular guy.
I forgot to deliver the groceries and made a speech instead.
In 1960, Richard Nixon used still shots to give him an heroic, man on the cusp of history aura. While Kennedy played up his accessibility by being the first candidate to interact with voters. In 1968, Nixon countered his impersonal image as the first candidate presented in close-up, while Hubert Humphrey played up his own genuineness by revealing the artifice of television packaging.
You don't think we ought to have a little podium up here?
When Watergate spurred a nationwide distrust of politicians altogether, Democrat Jimmy Carter ran as an outsider to the political process.
We need to have someone going to Washington who's not part of that establishment, who hasn't been there for the last 25 or 30 years.
That strategy didn't last long. By 1980, challenger Ronald Reagan was presenting himself as a stronger and more qualified commander-in-chief than President Carter.
I have repeatedly said in this campaign that I will sit down with the Soviet Union for as long as it takes to negotiate a balanced and equitable arms limitation agreement.
And in 1988, George Bush's positive ads blended the best of everyone's images.
I want a kinder and gentler nation.
What the Republicans did in 1988 was took traditional Democratic strengths, caring, compassion, identification with family, and visually identified George Bush with them. Then identified Dukakis with everything that was alien to those values. The Bush campaign strategy is brilliant.
So after 40 years, what have we learned about so-called positive ads? It seems, as our experts suggest, that we should watch them with a particularly wary eye.
What's interesting about the difference between positive and negative advertising, we might as well use the terms, is that negative advertising is now held to a very tough standard because reporters report on it. But curiously enough, there's almost no reporting done, or very tough reporting done, on the claims made in positive spots. So in a way, you can say almost anything you want about your own client, so long as you tell the truth about your opponent. And that is a very strange double standard.
Although some say the job of political advertising is to talk about issues, there is no doubt the ads are an issue all by themselves. There are 5 key questions that voters have about these spots. Are they manipulative? Do they sell rather than inform? Do they even tell the truth? And if they don't, how can you tell? And finally, are ads designed to help us make a decision or just to make the news?
I want to see us once again have a nation that's as good and honest and decent and truthful and is filled with love as all the American people.
And I hear them, and I am moved.
We must either love each other or we must die.
The number 1 question, are we being manipulated?
All advertising is manipulation. But we have to remember that a lot of the manipulation doesn't work. People have defense mechanisms that prevent the manipulations from working.
Richard Wirthlin says voter research supports this idea.
I believe the public has developed something I call a communication callus. They decide within about 8 minutes or 8 seconds of a 30-second spot whether they're going to continue to watch and listen. They don't need a mechanical device to switch stations. Many Americans can do that very efficiently psychologically.
For just that reason, consultants concentrate on playing to your feelings, attempting to push your emotional hot buttons.
Never before in our lives have we been so confronted with this reality. Who is your choice to be a heartbeat away from the presidency?
The most powerful man in the world is also mortal. We know this all too well in America. 1 in 5 American vice presidents has had to rise to the duties of commander-in-chief. 1 in 5 has had to take on the responsibilities for the most powerful office in the world. For this job, after 5 months of reflection, George Bush made his personal choice, J. Danforth Quayle.
So are we or aren't we immune to the rapid flow of images that play before us? We may not be as protected as we think.
What television did was change the speed with which the attack could be offered, and hence increase the difficulty of the audience in processing it. At the same time, television made it possible to take visual, visceral, highly evocative images and let them substitute for a traditional argument. Now the pictures can move past you at a second and a half apiece, and you don't have time to say, wait a minute, what's Hubert Humphrey doing next to the soldier in Vietnam? This is of particular concern because a large portion of the electorate gets most of its political information from these kinds of ads.
When's the last time you saw a newscast discuss a candidate's position on an issue in any detail? Maybe a little bit on PBS, but other than that, very little about their positions on issues. So people rely on political advertising to actually determine where people stand on the issues.
With Reaganomics, you create incentives that move us all forward. With Mondalenomics, you raise taxes.
Any voter who views political advertising and takes the claims made at face value is a fool. Any voter who is serious about his or her task of evaluating candidates has to follow up that political advertising by reading the advertising watches that are published today in most major newspapers, and I hope eventually on television stations as well. You simply can't take the claims at face value.
The Republicans have always felt that the best way to control inflation is to put people out of a job.
I pledge to all Americans that we'll get inflation under control and keep it under control.
No matter what tactics are used, there are some experts who feel voters are smart enough to make good judgments.
I think that what we have done is that we have sped up television so much that we now believe that the audience is an audience that couldn't follow a discourse or even know what the word discourse might mean. I think that's crazy. I think I know voters are smarter than the politicians and those of us who work for them. And my guess is that most television viewers are smarter than the people that produce television programs.
Yet 30 and 60-second communications virtually demand oversimplification.
This is America, spring of '84. And this is America. And this is America.
Manipulative or not, the idea of wrapping up a candidate's stand in a 30-second spot brings up another fundamental question. Are politicians sold like products?
Whether we like it or not, candidates are sold like soap and cornflakes. And many of the techniques used for political television advertising is not terribly different from the techniques used for product television advertising.
If you have people working together and feeling good about one another, then you can work on the other problem.
A kind and decent man who's making us proud again. President Ford.
But soap and cornflakes don't give political consultants headaches.
Packaged goods don't jump off the shelf and hold press conferences and say crazy things and do crazy things, and candidates sometimes do.
If you give me a week, I might think of one. I don't remember.
At the same press conference, President Eisenhower said,
"No one can make a decision except me."
In the 80s and 90s, what you see is a much more sophisticated process because much more information is going into the advertising. Why? Because we have learned through the process of trial and error that people crave information about these candidates. So in all the advertising, positive advertising, comparative advertising, negative advertising, we're pumping an enormous amount of information through those commercials out so that voters can make their decisions.
What kind of information do we receive? Or in other words, do political ads tell the truth? We asked Kathleen Jamison, author of the new book, Dirty Politics, Deception, Distraction, and Democracy.
Most political ads are in fact truthful most of the time. Most product ads are also truthful most of the time. When political ads lie, it usually isn't in something they say. It's an inference they invite in you as an audience member.
Most experts agree political ads tell the truth most of the time. The question is, when they don't, how can you tell?
One of the things to look out for is when you hear an assertion in the commercial, do they prove it in the commercial? In other words, if they say their candidate is a conservationist and cares about the environment, do they have an environmental organization citation that says so? Do they have a rank order from some organization that might be respected that will tell you that you can trust this assertion in the commercial? In other words, look for the proofs. Assertions without proofs are often assertions that cannot be proved.